Hello and welcome to the Sex Within Marriage podcast. My name is JD and I blog over at uncoveringintimacy.com. And last week, Gary Thomas posted an article on his Substack on the topic of discipline versus punishment, not taking a stance, but rather offering it up as a controversial conversation starter. Reading it made me curious about something. Does your view of hell change your parenting approach? After all, if God is our example and you believe that hell is eternal punishment, does that lend to a more heavy-handed approach to parenting versus someone who believes that hell is an act of mercy? And I posed that question in our forum, and that led to a discussion on using physical punishment. And I spent a fair bit of time in the last week or two writing on that thread, so I thought I'd repurpose it here for those who might be curious about how we raise our children and why. Because we, that is Christina and I, don't believe that hell is eternal torture. We don't believe such a view is in keeping with the Bible, and while we both grew up in a denomination that taught that it was one of the reasons we left, because the doctrine couldn't stand up to either biblical scrutiny or logic as we saw it. And if you want to know why and or argue that stance, I fully welcome you to read the post, What Happens When You Die, that I wrote about 4 years ago now. But that's not the point of this episode. The point of this one is to share why we don't spank our children, and now that my children are growing up into adults, what the outcome of such a choice has been. Before we get to that, though, just quickly, if you haven't filled out the survey yet, please go and do that. This is probably your last chance to get your data in. I'm probably going to be doing the analysis for next week, whether we hit 1,000 or not. We've only need 100 and some odd left to go, so if you want to help us hit 1,000 responses, really it wouldn't take many of you to jump in and do it. And with that out of the way, let's get to the topic at hand. Now, I think hell is one of the greatest showcases of God's character. When I was growing up, I was raised in a denomination that taught that, one, you are either predestined for heaven or hell, and free will is an illusion. Number two, that hell is eternal torture. And number three, that very few people will go to heaven, relatively speaking. And so I grew up being taught that God created everyone, randomly picked a few selected to go to heaven, and the rest he would torture for eternity for a choice that he didn't make. It also made evangelism a bit of a farce, but that's a topic for another day. And this set of beliefs to me does not depict a loving God. Rather, it shows an entity that gets closest to deserving eternal torment than any other being I've met or heard of. And even then, I think the punishment is overkill. I mean, this depicts an evil worse than history's largest villains. It is the equivalent of having children, choosing one at random to treat like a king, and then torturing the rest while simultaneously keeping them alive. Except in this case, it's trillions of children, and they are alive forever. Even if you believe in different variations of this, for example, maybe you believe in free will, then you're still left with a father raising children that he fully intends to torture the vast majority of beyond their natural lifespan. In this case, an infinite lifespan. And if this is the view of God that you hold to, and you somehow have managed to hold on to the cognitive dissonance that it is loving, then I completely understand why one could be deceived into thinking that beating your children is a loving act. It is because your view of love is distorted. Now, when I grew up and started studying it for myself, I learned more about God and hell and realized that, one, God picks all of us. Number two, we don't all pick God. Number three, if we pick God, then our works are the evidence of that choice, but it is the choice that keeps our name in the book of life. If we do not choose him, then our names are blotted out. And lastly, eventually God will destroy sin, and if we have chosen to stand with sin, then we will be destroyed along with it. God is not keeping sin around, and he's certainly not participating in the sin to keep it around and keep us continually being tortured by it for eternity, because that would make him an evil God. And I'm going through this quickly because my intent is not to debate hell. I did that in the other post, which I'll link to in the show notes. But this paints a very different picture of God and subsequently love. God is not a cruel person who created the majority of mankind only to see them tortured for eternity, an eternity that he manufactures. Rather, God created us to be free in the hopes that we would see sin for what it is and choose life with him. If we do not, then we go back to where we came from. Nothingness. No harm, no foul in the grand scheme of things. In this situation, death is a mercy. It is a final loving act. It is the acknowledgement that a child has grown up and chosen to disown his father. And so all support is removed at their request. In this case, it just so happens that their very existence comes from the father. So when you remove that inheritance, the only possible outcome is death. Not because you were killed, but because you rejected life and it was removed from you. It is God saying, I wish you had chosen differently, but I will respect your wishes. If we choose death and destruction, then we get death and destruction. And with this view of God and love, the idea of hell being torture is, well, it makes no sense. This God, this love is focused on grace, on mercy, and on relationship. What utility does hell have? It teaches nothing because you cannot come back from it. It doesn't build a relationship because you are cut off. It doesn't build discipline because you cannot grow anymore. It doesn't bring hope because there is no hope in hell. It doesn't even teach anyone else because Judgment Day is the same day for everyone. And that happens after Christ returns. The very idea of eternal hell by a God that is loving is nonsense. And in the same way, claiming to love your child using this view of God and his love by beating them is nonsense. And you know that if you take a second to think about it, because the hypocrisy jumps out pretty quickly. If your child hits another child and in response you tell them not to hit people, and then you hit them, what do they learn? Well, they're primarily going to learn that their parent is a hypocrite. But of course, if they point that out to you, you will become enraged, and so you'll likely hit them again. And what part of that is loving? We taught our children that it's not okay to hit people. Now, there are some exceptions. They know that they can defend themselves, and they understand when violence is allowed, such as during martial arts training. But in day-to-day life, violence is not okay. And that rule goes for children as well as parents. I have hit my kids when we were training, but I'm using 1% of my strength or less, and they've got pads on to protect them. They're also anticipating it, and they know this is not for punishment, because we don't hit people because we're upset with them. And outside of that, I've never had to hit them because the only other acceptable use would be if my life was threatened, and I have never had my life threatened by my own children. So I don't get to hit them. And many people have told me over the years that children should have a healthy fear of their parents. To me, this just teaches your children to run from you rather than towards you when there is trouble. You build better liars and deceivers, but not better people. My parents raised me this way, and to this day, I would not go to them for advice if I was in trouble. I would run from them and go somewhere safe because I do not see them as safe people. I wanted better for my own children. And now when my children make mistakes, they come to me. They ask for help. They ask for forgiveness, knowing that it will be given. And we don't punish them for mistakes. There may be consequences, but that's not the same thing. Often we negotiate the consequences with them because ultimately they need to learn how to set their own consequences to bad decisions and make their own rules. And honestly, sometimes they choose harsher punishments than I do. My kids call me out actually for not holding them accountable for their punishments. If I let them off the hook, down the road, they will probably tell me that I probably shouldn't have done that. Usually not in the moment because they're happy to have whatever restriction it was lifted. But later, looking back, they realize that that may have not been the best thing for me to do. And do they sometimes still try to hide and deceive? Yeah, especially when they're younger. Adam and Eve did the same thing, even with a perfect father. But as they get older, they come to us more easily, asking for help before problems arise. And if there is a problem, their parents are the first people they turn to. And I wanted that relationship with them, and I'm glad to say it's worked out that way. And if our theology is correct, we should see evidence of that in real life. And this is one of the reasons I like running surveys. I like seeing the intersection between theology and practical application. So this week I did some searching for large meta-studies, studies collecting data from multiple other studies. And I'll put 2 of the links in the show notes of the ones that I read through. And here are some of the stats that I found. Firstly, somewhere between 70 to 90% of parents spank their children. Second is that corporal punishment from parents leads to higher aggression rates in their children. It becomes a cycle of the child being more aggressive, the parents ramping up their aggression to match it, and then the child, of course, responding with more aggression, bringing more physical punishment. Spanking also doesn't make children more compliant in the short term. It's not linked with long-term compliance either or internalization of morals, because they don't adopt what they should do. They only flee from what's hurting them. And if you have ever met a Christian running from hell versus one that is drawing closer to God, you know that those aren't the same thing at all. Spanking is not linked with reductions in aggression or antisocial behavior. It's actually linked with worse, not better behavior in children. And it is associated with significantly more aggression and antisocial behavior problems. Not one of the studies in this meta-study showed a link between spanking and better behavior. Now, these were pulled from 75 studies over 50 years from 13 different countries. 160,000 children were included. So if spanking children worked, we should see evidence of it. Instead, statistically, we see the opposite. While all the wished-for behaviors that I hear from parents who spank their children, my children seem to have picked up without the need to spank them, such as internalization of morals, less aggressive, better behavior, and a good relationship between parents and kids, as well as with their siblings. But it actually gets worse than this. 75% of abuse cases against children in Canada start as physical punishment that gets carried away. Children who are spanked are 7 times more likely to be severely assaulted by their parents. Infants who are spanked are 2.3 times more likely to require medical attention due to an injury inflicted by a parent. In fact, what they found in the meta-analysis is that spanking has all the same outcomes as physical abuse, only with 2/3 of the strength and correlation. So this means it is abuse. It's merely less severe. And I found it interesting, too, that kids who have been spanked are more likely to develop anxiety and depression disorders. They have more difficulties in school and with skills of regulation. There's also correlation between physical punishment and decreased brain gray matter in areas associated with performance on intelligence tests. And further studies showed that spanking a child from ages 2 to 4 shows, on average, a 5-point drop in IQ. Between the ages of 5 and 9, it's a 2.8 drop in IQ. And the correlation gets stronger the older they are when you stop spanking them. Countries where spanking is more prevalent tend to have lower national IQs as well. So you are literally taking away their intelligence by spanking them. So in summary, kids who are spanked have higher aggression, lower conflict resolution skills. They have a higher chance of depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders, and an increased struggle with self-regulation. And this all sets them up to struggle more in their marriages when they grow up as well. And yet, kids who are spanked tend to have a more positive view of physical punishment, and so they are more likely to use it on their own children. And to me, this sounds like a generational curse, if ever there was one. Now, people will say, doesn't the Bible tell us to beat our children? And there are some confusing Bible verses that get brought up when this topic is discussed. Probably the strongest one that is brought up is Proverbs 23, verses 13 to 14. And it says, "Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell." And the problem with this verse is that Proverbs is often poetic instead of literal. And you may think that's a cop-out until you read Exodus 21, verse 20, where it says, "If a man hits his servant or his maid with a rod and he dies, he shall be severely punished." So the problem here is that the Bible says that if you beat a grown man or woman with a rod, you may very well kill them. And that makes sense because a rod is not a small stick. It is a club. It is a wooden equivalent of a mace. In fact, David used a rod to kill lions and bears. So as for what this proverb means, there is lots of debate, and I'm not entirely sure myself. But it certainly cannot mean what the plain reading is, because both logic and the Bible tell us that you very well can kill a child by hitting them with a rod. And for myself, I don't build doctrines out of verses that contradict the rest of the Bible. I would rather set that one verse aside for a time until I grow in understanding, rather than set the rest of the Bible aside in favor for that one verse, because nothing about beating a child with a club seems to line up with the rest of Scripture. Lastly, the most common verse I hear is Proverbs 13, verse 24. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. And the problem with this verse is that people no longer know what a rod was used for. A shepherd's rod, like I said, is a short club-like stick. It is a symbol of authority. The kings and pharaohs had rods. They had scepters. That's the same kind of thing. And it was also used to guide sheep, to count them. But the only time it is used to hit someone or something is when you're hitting an enemy, like a bear or a lion or someone trying to steal your sheep. And then you are literally trying to kill them. This is a weapon in those situations. And so I believe, in light of the context of the culture that it's talking about, this is not talking about physical violence against your children, but rather authority and guidance. Discipline comes in many ways, and violence is the lazy and I'd argue evil route to do it. So for us, we are glad we chose not to spank our children from the beginning. Is it harder? Absolutely. You have to use your brain, patience, gentleness, kindness, self-control, and other fruit of the Spirit in place of violence. No one ever said it was going to be easy, but it has been worth the effort for us, and statistically, it seems like it's not a fluke. Now, if you disagree, want to debate, have questions, want to share your experiences, etc., feel free to post them in the comments. I am not afraid to have people disagree with me. In fact, I welcome the discussion. And if you agree, I'd love to hear from you in the comments as well, so that people don't feel like they're alone if they choose this path. Like I said, these studies say 70 to 90% of parents choose to spank their children. So when you don't, you can certainly feel like you're the odd man out. But then we as Christians should be comfortable feeling that way anyways. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. Once again, don't forget to take the survey if you haven't yet. Funnily enough, it does have a question about spanking, I believe, although in a very different context. And that's it for today. Talk to you next time.